You woke up this morning and made choices, as did I. You decided you were gonna go to the gym, or maybe not. I decided I was gonna put my hat on sideways. Whatever the case may be, we make choices every single day that feel like our own. And that feeling is so constant, so underwhelming, that no one really ever questions it. We just move along. And the ability to make those choices is what we call free will. But don't just take my word for it. I'm just some random UNCW undergrad. So let's look back at some of the earliest and most prominent examples of what people think free will is. René Descartes. I don't know if I said that right, but we're gonna move on. Descartes is quite literally known as the father of modern philosophy. So I think this holds some weight. In the early 1600s, he wrote that the mind is one unified controller. So like, you can cut my arm off, but you can't take a part of my brain out. And I think that's very interesting because the key words there is unified controller. That's important. We're gonna talk about that later. Another prime example of a name that holds weight is Immanuel Kant. Don't know if I'm saying that one right either, but we're gonna move on. His idea was actually even more philosophical than Descartes, but he says that free will has to exist because without it, we literally cannot hold people morally responsible for their actions. Meaning, if there is no free will, how can you go to jail for something? That's kind of a valid point, to be quite honest with you. I mean, these are quite literally some of the greatest thinkers of all time, and they didn't even question it. And they both came to the same conclusion. Different paths, same end destination. That's pretty cool. Now, someone who constantly did question things was a slightly less household name, a man that goes by the name of Roger Sperry. Now, I understand that that's not necessarily a household name, but he did win a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. So I'd say he kind of has some valid points here, especially for the neuroscience attack that we are about to take onto this philosophical endeavor. Now, Roger Sperry was specifically recognized for his split brain work, which essentially he discovered through these experiments the functional differences between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Now, we're about to get slightly more serious, so I'm gonna be less of a clown with my hat, but his road to that prize did not start with some philosophical mission, but it was actually with epilepsy patients. Now, there's a structure in your brain known as the corpus callosum, and basically what it is a clump of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. It's like a communication bridge, basically. And that's important to note because a neurosurgeon named William Van Wagenen actually wanted to cut it in the early 40s, late 30s. And his idea behind that was for epilepsy patients. Now, if you have a seizure and it spreads across the whole brain, that's bad, real bad. Seizures are not good. However, what is good is stopping the damage or at least significantly reducing it. So he thought if you cut the communication between the left side and the right side, maybe the seizure won't spread all the way across the brain and you won't get as brutally fucked. Pardon my French. Now, with that being said, it wasn't until later on that two men actually refined the surgery, one by the name of Philip Vogel and the other Joseph Bogen. They turned it into like a full, complete surgery and actually followed through with it. Now, the reason I say that is because the patients of Vogel and Bogen are the ones who Roger Sperry did his experiments on. Now, at the time, Sperry was working at Caltech, and one of his undergrad students actually wrote him a letter and asked to work with him. So Sperry agreed. And whether he knew it or not, they were genuinely going to change the entire future of neuroscience as a whole. But what they found didn't just matter for neuroscience, it genuinely raises questions about some of the deepest human beliefs that our society has accepted. And I know, that's a wild claim, I get it, but think about it. Neuroscience at that time was not what it is today. So when you make a discovery like that, you're like, holy shit, it's a discovery. This is incredible, okay? Cool, but we get those discoveries pretty much every day now. We discover something new about the brain or pretty much just something crazy, like literally nonstop because of the technology that we have. But back then, that's not how it worked. So when they see something like that, everyone's flabbergasted and they run with it. They don't question it any further. They take their findings and they're like, cool, bet. So the experiments, right? What actually happened? What did they do? Okay, so to understand the experiments, first you have to understand that one eye is connected essentially to one side of the brain and vice versa. So like your Your left eye talks to the right hemisphere and your right eye talks to the left hemisphere. Now that's important because that's essentially the method that Sperry and Gazzaniga ran with these split brain patients in order to test the left and right sides independently. So in a normal brain, your corpus callosum connects everything, so you wouldn't notice that. But with these patients, it's gone. They're split. So you can test the left side and the right side of the brain independently from one another, which is very interesting. So there's a few experiments that Sperry and Gazzaniga did that are very important to this topic. So the first one is that they showed a word to each side of the brain. The way that they showed an image to each side of the brain is very simple. They just covered an eye, and because the brain was split, if they showed the right eye, the left hemisphere was getting the information, and vice versa. Basically, what they did was they showed a patient a word that was related to an object. So like if I saw the word camera, I could like point at the camera. So what they did was they showed the left hemisphere first, and the patient was able to say the word camera. But when they showed the right hemisphere, the person said that they didn't see anything. They could not verbalize what they saw. Language meant nothing. However, when they were asked to point at it, they could. That's really fucking weird, don't you think? Now, this basically demonstrated that the right hemisphere had successfully processed the information, but the patient could not consciously verbalize it. Another set of experiments that they did was also very interesting because they observed a phenomenon known as confabulation. So this one's very interesting. They showed patients' right hemisphere a command such as walk. Now, the patient would get up and walk, and then they would ask why he did that. Now, and what's so odd about it is that they couldn't explain why they did it. The left hemisphere, which controls language, didn't receive the information, but the patient still got up and walked. And then when language asked why they did it, they just lied. They made something up that had nothing to do with anything. Like they would just say, "Oh, I wanted to go get a Coca-Cola." What the fuck? No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Now, to connect the dots there, essentially what happened is the right side of the brain would do something, and the left side of the brain would give a reason for it that did not add up. It would just kind of try to conceptualize it later. Even like they just odd. Like I said, in the 60s, they didn't have these crazy discoveries all the time, so it's pretty easy to just accept science for what it is, science, and not look too much deeper. But if you do decide to look deeper, it genuinely begins to raise a plethora of questions about the human psyche. So with that being said, why not dive deeper, right? So another personal favorite of mine is when they decided to flash images to each side of the brain to these patients. And what they decided to do was just flash normal images, whatever, and then randomly throw an image of a nude woman on the screen. I wish I was alive in the 80s. Now, when they showed the left hemisphere, it was a pretty normal response. The lady chuckled and, they asked her why, and she was like, "Oh, it was a nude woman." Like, okay, whatever. But when they did the same on the right hemisphere, the response was a bit different. She lied. She goes, "Oh, nothing. Just that funny machine." Huh? Why you lying, bro? It's interesting because both hemispheres of the brain had the same overt reaction, a chuckle, a giggle, but they could not both fully conceptualize what had actually happened. When shown to the right side of the brain, she had the same reaction, but could not figure out why. But on the left side, she could figure out why, which would kind of suggest that the action happens first and the conceptualizing of why happens later. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, we're gonna get into that a bit later, but for now, let's focus on the fact that this goes to show the brain is divided. It's not just a unified system. Two hemispheres can act independently of one another. They can produce outputs and, in some cases, not have a mutual awareness of what happened. Now, that raises an important question about the nature of self. Now, the experiment showed that the left side can process language and the right side can process things like spatial information or nonverbal recognition. What's interesting is that when the sides don't communicate, decisions are still made. That would mean that in a divided brain, there is divided control, not just a singular self. Just like nature and nurture is important, the left and right hemisphere are also important. And if they can both make decisions about something, then which one has free will? Now, I mentioned earlier that the patient would get up and walk, and then the other side of the brain would try to conceptualize it later and be wrong. So what that invites is the idea that you could be making a decision with one part of your brain and later conceptualizing it. So I thought about that and decided, okay, is there any research to show that might be true? That's where we land on Benjamin Libet. In a series of experiments that he conducted in the 80s, he asked patients to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, and he measured their brain activity while they did that. The results of this experiment ended up showing a buildup of what we call a readiness potential. And this readiness potential shows up prior to a conscious decision that's made. So what that shows is that your brain is doing the work before you decide to consciously think about it. What? When you combine the works of Sperry and Libet, it kind of morphs into something deeper. Sperry provides the anatomy and Libet provides the timing. First, you understand that the brain is divided, and then you find out that it's making decisions before you're consciously aware of them. And together, they biologically reframe what's possible in terms of our definition of free will. Libet even talked about free will after his findings. A lot of philosophers were pushing back on him, so he decided to talk about it himself. After his initial experiments, he wrote, "The role of conscious free will would be then not to initiate a voluntary act, but to control whether the act takes place." Essentially, what he's suggesting is the idea of a free won't instead of a free will. Now, even as a veto, consciousness is still arriving late, and it's also working with incomplete information across a divided brain. Libet shows it's slow, and Sperry shows it's split. Neither portrait resembles the unified sovereign commander that previous philosophy has agreed upon. The idea of free will has been a long time coming. It's a philosophical groundwork that's kind of always going to change, and quite frankly, I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of it. Guys, I'm genuinely tweaking because my camera died and I don't know when, but hear me out, okay? I'm literally in the trees to explain this to you guys. If you took nothing else away from this video, think about this, please. The world is not changed from taking things at surface value. Whether you agree with the points that I made or not, whether you think it's important that free will is challenged or not, that doesn't fucking matter. What matters is that the world is not changed by taking things at surface value, okay? Oh my. Van Wagenen said, okay, there's a big thing connecting literally a whole half of the brain. I don't want epileptic people to suffer anymore. What if we cut it so it doesn't f them up as bad? That's a bridge connected. You change the world by looking deeper and connecting bridges. He looked deeper, realized the brain thing, thought about epileptics. That was the bridge that he connected and said, let's do something about it. Then it got improved upon by two other neuroscientists. Then Roger Sperry saw that, and instead of going, oh, that's a pretty cool experiment that they did, that's a pretty cool surgery that they did, he said, how can I apply this? And that's a bridge connected. He ran his own experiments on it. He went deeper into it. He won a fucking Nobel Prize for it, dude. It's gotta be a good method, bro. Everyone who changes the world sees something and goes deeper and then applies that knowledge somewhere else. Boom, fucking world changed, baby. It's so sick. It's such a cool idea to grasp. Think about it this way, okay? I don't know the history of it, but think about, just conceptualize this for me, okay? You need testosterone in your body to build muscle, and you need a lot of it, which means, and that's literally what steroids are, okay? You inject testosterone. But think about it for a second. Someone out there knew a lot about hormones to the point where they could create testosterone, like they could create it, they could put it in a needle. They could put testosterone in a needle. Someone knew about hormones enough to do that. Someone else knew about bodybuilding enough and putting on muscle that they knew that you needed the testosterone. Someone out there thought, what if you take a needle of testosterone and stab it into the body and go, do I get muscles? That changed the fucking world, dude. That's crazy. You know how many people are taking testosterone now? It's ridiculous. Listen, I'm not saying it was for the better, but I'm saying that it changed the world. That's nuts, dude. Every single thing that ever changed the world happened that way. There was something, someone got deeper knowledge, and then applied it somewhere else. It's fucking crazy, dude. That's how you change the world, bro. I can't put it any plainer and simpler than that. Don't give a shit if you agree with what I said, if you think it matters or not. Take knowledge that you have, get a little bit deeper than the last person, and apply it to some other aspect of your life, because every single person out here has different experiences. Every single person can relate things to other things that other people would not have thought to relate it to. For example, I just related this whole thing to steroids, but not everyone would do that. Just like I'm not going to come up to the same conclusion that Roger Sperry would have if I told him this framework back in the day. The idea is that you take knowledge, go deeper, bridge a gap, boom, world change. That's dope. It doesn't really get any simpler than that, to be honest. So if you want to change the world, that's pretty much how you got to go about it, fellas.